In the rock and roll business, the musicians have people that do these things for them. The roadies. The roadies. That's what our roadies wouldn't even have to go anywhere. They could just come here every week. It's a bit of a strange thing to say, but I've always felt that it would have been much better if the book of Genesis had ended last week, at the end of last week's Torah portion, instead of ending it with the Torah portion that we read this morning. Think about it for a second. The end of last week's Torah portion, everything seemed to be in such a nice, warm, tight package. Joseph and the brothers were reconciled. There was this moving vignette of them. You remember weeping and embracing one another. It's very nice. Jacob comes to Egypt, so he's reunited with his beloved son Joseph for the first time in 20 years. Jacob comes and he brings all the other Israelites. They settle in Goshen, and very quickly they become a prosperous community there. Even Joseph's personal journey seems to have reached a very nice resolution in last week's Parsha. The arrogant Joseph that we met at the beginning of his narrative has become humbler, and he's become a forgiving person, or so it seems. And even the concluding verse of last week's Torah portion is kind of the Torah's equivalent of, and they lived happily ever after. This is the verse, end of last week's Parsha. So Israel, meaning Jacob, Israel settled in the country of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and increased greatly. It's a perfect ending. Everybody's happy. Everybody's forgiven. Everybody's getting along. Cue the credits. Let them ride off into the sunset. It's perfect. Only problem is Genesis didn't end last week. Genesis ended this week. And the picture that the Torah leaves us with at the end of the portion that we read this morning is a much less rosy, much messier, much more difficult, and much more ambivalent message. It's almost as if the authors of the Torah undid every good thing from last week and pulled the rug right out from under our feet. So think about this week's portion and where it leaves us. Jacob appears throughout the portion to be bitter and even a bit vindictive, purposefully choosing his younger grandson Ephraim for the blessing that he bestows that should have gone to the older grandson, Manasseh, thereby repeating a mistake that's made from one generation to the next throughout the book of Genesis. Jacob should know better than anybody that that's the wrong thing to do and that it's problematic, doesn't seem to care, and he does it anyway. He then calls his sons to his deathbed so that he can give them a last message, and you would think he would say something nice, something encouraging to them, but instead, mostly he spends the time telling them what they've done wrong in the course of their lives, and then he leaves them with that bitter taste in their mouths. And then when Jacob dies, the Torah makes it quite clear that the reconciliation between Joseph and the brothers that seemed so genuine last week and looked so nice, actually not so much. Joseph goes to visit Jacob. It's interesting, he goes by himself. He doesn't go with the brothers. Then the brothers come later. And then when they travel, Joseph and the brothers together, to bring Jacob back to the land of Israel for burial, the brothers need to use a messenger to communicate with Joseph. They can't go and speak to him directly. Clearly, he's not approachable, A, and B, he's keeping himself apart from the other brothers. And that is not what you would expect if everything between them was okay. And then there is that communication. The brothers use the messenger to send to Joseph. In that communication, if you read the text closely, you realize that the brothers lie to Joseph. They say to him, "Our father, Jacob, told us to remind you that when he dies, you should forgive us for what we did to you." We know it's a lie because we know Jacob didn't know what the brothers had done to Joseph, so they're lying right to his face. Joseph is not a dummy. He knows that they're lying, but his response is interesting. This is what he says to them exactly. On the surface, it sounds wonderful. He says, "Have no fear. Hatachat Elohim anochi. Am I a substitute for God? Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Do not be afraid. I will sustain you and your children." Sounds nice, But read between the lines a little bit. What does he say to them? He says to them, you intended me harm. So he's reminding them just when they're most afraid that he has not forgotten what they've done. And also, what does he not say in his response? He does not say, I forgive you, which he had the opportunity to say. He chooses not to. So if you're one of the brothers, you are left thinking, first of all, Joseph has not forgotten what we've done. And second of all, not only has he not forgotten it, he hasn't forgiven us for it either. And it's also interesting in this same scene, the message going back and forth between Joseph and the brothers, that the brothers finally do come into Joseph's presence, and what do? They bow down to him. So it goes back to the dreams that he had at the beginning when he did have this sense of entitlement and that he should be and would be better than all of the brothers. The Torah brings it right back to that idea and that personality that Joseph has struggled with throughout his life. So the pretty picture that we had at the end of last week's parsha of Jacob and Joseph and the brothers and the relationship between them, by the end of this week's portion, I think it's pretty much gone, shattered. So why didn't the Torah just leave us last week and let us go on our merry way, feeling good about everything, and we could just move into the book of Exodus nice and rosy? And I think the answer is this. We all know that we don't live in the world reflected in last week's Torah portion. That's not the world that we live in. A world where everybody gets along all the time, and everything is great, and everybody's happy. It's not our world. It's just not real life. But we do all live in the world of this week's Torah portion. A world where families wrestle with tension, where jealousy and anger motivate people just as often as goodness and kindness, where people have regrets about things that they've done in their lives, sometimes very serious regrets, and where illness exists, where forgiveness is hard to find and even harder to grant to someone else. That's real life. It's messy, and it's difficult, and it's challenging. And this week's Torah portion might not feel as good as last week's Torah portion, but I would argue it certainly feels much more familiar than last week's Torah portion. And that, in my mind, is one of the great things about the Torah as literature. It is not afraid to show us how difficult life really is. It's not afraid to reflect real life, the real lives that we experience. It's not afraid to show us that human beings, even great human beings, by the way, even the Torah's greatest heroes, are seriously flawed. And at the same time, it suggests to us that in a difficult world, dealing with people's imperfections, which we all do all of the time, including, by the way, our own imperfections, even in spite of all of that, we can make a meaningful life and we can be partners with God in creating a world that's better than it is now, and we can become members in a sacred faith community, which is what we're here about today. I love the moment in Shul that we just experienced together when we read the last verses of a book of the Torah, and what happens? We all stand, the Torah reader finishes those last verses, and then the entire congregation chants what? Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Literally translated, be strong, v'nit chazek, and let us be strong together. Together we will be strengthened. Probably the real meaning of the phrase is this. Chazak, the first chazak, you're saying to the Torah reader. Where'd Sandy go? Sandy, chazak, chazak to you. Our main Torah reader here at Bethel throughout the year, and you finished another book of the Torah yet again. So be strong, in other words, job well done. The second chazak to the person who had the aliyah. Who had that seventh aliyah? Don't remember? Irene Snyder. Well, really it was the Maftir aliyah where we said chazak, chazak, and that was Howard. So Howard, chazak to you, not only for very nicely read Haftarah, but that you helped the congregation complete that book of the Torah, the book of Genesis again, yet another year. And then v'nit chazek, we're all strengthened together because as a congregation, we enabled that moment to happen. Were we not here, there was not a minyan this morning, the Torah wouldn't come out of the ark, and the book of Genesis would be left incomplete. So all three parties needed to play a role. The reader, the person who said the brachot, and the congregation that enabled it to happen. But in thinking about the world that we live in today, the world of this week's Torah portion, that challenging and difficult and messy world, we might understand the phrase differently. Chazak, chazak. There are times when you just have to be strong in the face of life's challenges, chazak. Then the second chazak, there are times when you have to be strong for other people, to be there for them and help them through a difficult time in their lives. And then, if you can be strong, and you can be strong for others, what happens? V'nit chazek. Together, truly, we can be strengthened, supporting one another and caring for one another as individuals, and through that process, making a community that we care about together. Shabbat Shalom.